Thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here, particularly honored by you guys preferring listening to me over sitting on the beach, right? And the weather is quite nice. Brighton, as you may know, is the original beach resort. I'm not going to talk about beach tourism or the weather outside. Instead, I'm going to focus on climate policy. It may seem that I have a very well-structured presentation. I'm going to start with a case for climate policy because I think that bears repeating. We'll talk a little bit about the design of climate policy, then much longer about the debate on climate policy, and then going to return to what is going on in the international and the national climate arenas. And this may strike you as a very well-structured presentation, but as we go along, you notice that it's actually not possible to separate it as neatly as I do here. So bear with me, I'll be going back and forth quite a bit. But I'll start with the case for climate policy. And that is shown in this particular graph. What you're looking at here is the result of a meta-analysis. And on the horizontal axis, you're looking at scenarios of climate change, here indicated by the change in the global mean surface air temperature relative to pre-industrial. So zero was roughly 150 years ago. And then on the vertical axis, you're looking at the welfare equivalent income loss. That is a bit of a mouthful. If we focus on 2.5 degrees, for which we have most data, then essentially what this means is that 2.5 degrees of global warming, degrees Celsius by the way, of global warming would make the average person feel as if she had lost 1.3% of her income. Does not mean that she had lost 1.3% of her income, but she feels as if she had lost 1.3% of her income. That's how you should read this graph. The blue dots are the 27 published estimates of the welfare impact of climate change. And this is not a sample, this is the population. There's a great many things we can say about this graph. The first thing that you may notice is that we focus on the red line, which is sort of a fitted curve through the observations that we have. Observations, of course, we can't observe the future, right? These are all sort of different model studies by different people using different methods. But let's call them observations for a moment. If we sort of look at the red curve that is the best fit through these observations, then the first thing you notice is that initial warming is probably positive. And that is because if it gets warmer, we don't need to spend as much money heating our homes in winter. If it gets warmer, fewer people will die of cold-related diseases. And if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, plants grow faster and become more water efficient. And all of these things are positive, and these positive effects actually dominate. But then later on, the negative effects, sea level rise, the spread of infectious disease, the cost of air conditioning in summer, river floods and everything, they start to dominate the picture. Now these initial benefits are actually irrelevant for policy because they're sunk benefits. As I said, this temperature is relative to pre-industrial times, relative to 150 years ago or so, and we're already at, depending on which data set you believe, at around 0.8 to 1 degree of warming. So we've already moved the first bit in this graph, and what you see is that things, at least incrementally, turn negative relatively soon compared to today. Now what you should keep in mind is that regulations change very slowly. Most of these emissions come from agriculture and energy use, and there's a lot of long-lived capital in these sectors. And of course, the carbon cycle itself and the climate system itself has great momentum. So regardless of what we do with our emissions, we're going to get past that cutoff point here, or that threshold point of 1.1 degree, regardless of what we do. And most people would say that actually stopping climate change at 2 degrees or even at 3 degrees is perhaps physically, perhaps technically, definitely economically and politically impossible, right? So the initial benefits are sunk benefits, and what matters is the downward part of the curve. Another thing that you notice is that there's actually a wide spread in these estimates. No surprise, we're looking into the far future. We're looking at the impact of something that we haven't observed in the recent past. We have seen sort of comparable climate change in the much more distant past, but that was well before there was such a thing as a human society, right? So there's simply no historical analog where we can really calibrate our data. So experts disagree on what the impact would be, and that is sort of shown in the dotted graphs where you see two things. One, the uncertainty is wide, but also the uncertainty is asymmetric. That is, negative surprises are much more likely than positive surprises of equal magnitude, right? So those are all important things to keep in mind. But perhaps for most people the most striking message from this graph is the order of magnitude. As I said, a 2.5 degrees of warming would lead to a welfare loss equivalent to a 1.3% loss in income. But 2.5 degrees of warming will not occur tomorrow. That's something that will happen over a period of 60 to 80 years. In other words, if we focus on the central estimate, a century of climate change is about as bad as losing a year of economic growth. And if you then start correcting for the fat tails and for the asymmetric uncertainty, then perhaps you can say, well, a century of climate change is about as bad as losing a decade of economic growth. But that is the order of magnitude of the problem as far as we can see. And this is in sharp contrast to the stuff that you would hear on radio and television and read on the internet. Ban Ki-moon, for instance, has spoken of the clear and present danger of climate change. Ban Ki-moon is, of course, the previous Secretary General of the United Nations. The previous Secretary of State of the US, John Kerry, has said that climate change is the most serious challenge we face. Christine Lagarde has said in an interview that future generations will be roasted, toasted, fried and grilled. One of my favorites, Desmond Tutu, as a person of as a quote, is that we fought apartheid, now climate change is our global enemy. And the estimates that I just very briefly discussed simply do not add up to this amount of alarm. And I'll come back to the reasons why. What I'm showing here is the impact along for the global average. What you're looking at here is the same study, same meta-analysis, same database. Essentially, we're looking at 2.5 degrees of warming, and now we're looking at all countries in the world. And the countries here are ranked according to their per capita income in the year 2005. And what you see is a very clear pattern that poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change, would suffer much more severe impacts of climate change than rich countries. And there's three basic reasons for that. One, poor countries are much more exposed. A lot of their economic activity is in agriculture, whereas our economic activity is in banking and finance, and that means that they are much more exposed to the weather and therefore climate. A second reason is that poorer countries tend to be in hotter places, and therefore their plants and animals are closer to the biophysical limits. And if they want to adapt to climate change, if you wonder what would the future be like in Brighton if it's 3 degrees warmer, then you look at Barcelona, right? And you wonder how will people live in a 3 degrees warmer climate in Brighton, look at Barcelona. If you live in one of the hottest places on the planet, Singapore, Dar es Salaam, there is no analog. And that means that you have to invent all your adaptations from scratch, both technical adaptation and behavioral adaptations. And the third reason is that for a lot of things that have to do with climate change and protecting yourself against the impacts of climate change, a lot of these things require large-scale infrastructure. If you wonder what will the impact of sea level rise be on London, then it all depends on what will replace the Thames barrier that currently keeps London safe from floods. And what we will need to do in the UK is build a bigger Thames barrier. It will be very costly, 10, 20, maybe 30 billion, but that is something that the UK can do. If you wonder what will the impact of sea level rise be on Lagos, the answer is not that in current condition that they will build something akin or something alike to the Thames barrier, because they simply do not have the government capacity to do so. Lagos is just a big mess. Now that immediately implies, as Tom Schelling was probably first to note, that this pattern of vulnerability will not remain constant. If in 50 years' time or 100 years' time Lagos is as rich as Lisbon is now, and as well governed as Lisbon is now, then you need not worry about the impacts of sea level rise on this city. But if Lagos stays the mess that it currently is, then climate change will have a big impact. And that is something to keep in mind, that the average, the global average, is not informative, and then there's various ways of addressing the impacts of climate change, right? One through development, the other through greenhouse gas emission reduction. Now, these are all total impacts of climate change. Total impacts of climate change are perhaps not what we want to look at. If you're looking for an optimum, then immediately you go to the first order conditions, that is, you look at a first partial derivative, and you can also sort of think, well, if I were the Prime Minister of the UK, then you would be in charge of a small part of the emissions, global emissions only, for a brief period of time, nominally 5 years, but of course Prime Ministers seem to come and go a bit faster nowadays, right? So we should be much more interested at the marginal effect. And that is what you're looking at here. Another meta-analysis, there's 1,200 plus estimates of the so-called social cost of carbon, or the marginal impact of CO2 emissions. This essentially tells you, if you put 1 additional ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, what is the welfare impact of that. And of course this is a stream of future impacts at the margin discounted back to today. And the answer, because there's 1,200 estimates or so, you can do fancy things like kernel density estimates, and that's what's going on here. In black, we're looking at all studies that have been published, and then in the colored graphs, you're looking at estimates for a particular utility discount rate, pure rate of time preference. That's what the PRTP stands for. What you find if you use a 3% pure rate of time preference, which is roughly what governments in rich countries do to evaluate public policy, you find that your modal estimate is something like $40 per ton of carbon. That would be your best guess. Immediately what you also notice is that if you use a relatively high discount rate, 3% PRTP, in this case you have a relatively small PGU tax, but if you use a lower discount rate, you care more about the future, you care more about about climate change therefore, and your carbon tax, your recommended carbon tax goes up, and you see that in the blue curve and the green curve. There's another thing that you notice, and that is that the spread increases. It's not just that your mode and your median and your mean shift to the right if you use a lower discount rate, but also your uncertainty increases. And that is completely intuitive. If you use a high discount rate, you only need to consider a short-term future. If you use a low discount rate, you need to look far into the future, and the further you look into the future, the more uncertain things become. And for instance, if you follow Nick Stern's advice and you advocate a pure rate of time preference of 0.1%, then you need to look 12,000 years into the future before your net present value converges. So this is the case for climate policy, right? The best guesses, even for a relatively high discount rate, are positive. That means this is a negative externality. PGU 1920 tells you that therefore we have to impose a carbon tax or equivalent regulation. There's many ways of designing a climate policy, a policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but the cheapest way to meet any target is to equate the costs at the margin. And that follows from a simple arbitrage condition. If your cost of emission reduction is $20 per ton and my cost of emission reduction is $10 per ton, then you should reduce less, save $20. I should reduce more, that will cost me $10. But then if you give me 5 of the 20 you just saved, we're actually both better off, right, by $15. So you should equate costs at the margin, and a carbon tax or tradable permits is one way to go about it. The good thing about a carbon tax is, from a regulatory perspective, is that you know what the price of emission reduction will be, at least at the margin, because that is the carbon tax that you just set. If you opt for a cap and trade system, you don't know what the price will be, unless you're so clever that you can perfectly predict what the market will do, right? And very few policymakers are so clever, although some pretend they are. And the good thing about the cap and trade system is that you know total emissions, because that is the cap that you set. With a carbon tax, you don't know what emissions will do, right? So there's an asymmetry there. It actually turns out, and this is per Weitzman 1974, that price certainty is worth more than quantity certainty. And that goes back to the fact that climate change is driven by global emissions accumulated over decades, if not centuries. That is what drives climate change, not your annual emissions in a small country. So if a country like the UK makes an error with its quantity of emissions, that has limited effect on climate change. Whereas if a country like the UK makes a mistake with its price, then that has major ramifications for the economy potentially. And that implies that price certainty is worth more than quantity certainty, and you should therefore opt for a carbon tax. Of course, this is not what policymakers have done, but this is what economic theory has told you. And then, of course, Tim Bergen would add that climate change is a simple externality. There's a single externality. There's one problem, so you need one solution. So the design of climate policy is very simple. We need a carbon tax and a carbon tax only, right? And then the carbon tax, again, through arbitrage conditions, should rise with the interest rate or something akin to the interest rate over time. Again, if not, it would be better to stick your money in the bank and reduce emissions later. The implication of all this is, of course, that your optimal climate policy design is unidimensional. You have a carbon tax that is the same for everybody, for all emissions, for all countries, from all sectors, and that rises predictably over time. So once you set the carbon tax in 2017 in the UK, you found the optimum, you found what it should be in all other countries. And that allows us to draw a supply curve that is easily interpreted and easily depicted, and that is what you're seeing here. On the vertical axis, you're looking at the carbon tax that would be imposed in the year 2015 on all emissions from all countries, from all sectors. There is rising with the interest rate over time, around the telling rate. And then on the horizontal axis, you're looking at the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases in the year 2100. So the horizontal axis, this is the policy that you would impose, and on the vertical axis, this is the policy you would impose, and on the horizontal axis, this is where you would end up. Or vice versa, if you want to go to 500 parts per million, this is the carbon tax that you should impose, right? This graph and the units that I'm talking about are all a bit mysterious, probably to most of you, tons of carbon, dollars. Just to put it in perspective, at the moment, the price of carbon in Europe, in the EU ETS, is around around €5 per ton of CO2, and that makes around $20 per ton of C. Right, there's a double transformation: euros, dollars, ton of C, ton of CO2. So that is around here, and it will get you, and that's the fed line here is the median of yet another meta-analysis, and that will get you to around 650 parts per million. The stated policy, the stated aim of international climate policy according to the Paris Agreement is to stabilize CO2 concentrations such that the temperature will not exceed 2 degrees or above pre-industrial. And that means if you want to have a 50-50 chance of getting there, that means you need to stabilize at around 450. And if you want to go to the 1.5 degrees, that is sort of the other target that is mentioned in the Paris Agreement, you need to go to around 400. And that implies that you need a carbon tax that is more like $800 to $1,000 per ton of C. What does that imply? A, we need to increase the intensity of European climate policy 40-fold. And we need to convince the rest of the world to, we actually don't just need to do that, we also need to expand European climate policy from now around 55% of emissions to 100% of emissions. And we need to convince the rest of the world to follow suit and impose a similarly stringent climate policy. That is if we want to have a 50-50 chance of meeting the 2 degrees target. Right? So this is a tad ambitious. Right? Now, what have I told you in the first 20 minutes or so? I told you that climate change is a relatively small problem. Right? Total welfare impact is not particularly alarming. And I've told you there's a simple solution, just impose a carbon tax. Now, if you follow the international media and the national media about the climate debate, you would walk away with the impression that climate change is terribly controversial and terribly difficult. Right? So how come? Why would you get this impression? So what I'm going to do next is take you through the political economy of the climate debate. And it used to be, at least in Europe, that the church offered a unified theory. The Bible tells you how the world works and how the world was created, and so on and so forth, but it also told you how to behave in that world. It told you 2 things, right? It gave you the what if, and it also gave you how to be a good human. The Enlightenment ended all that. Essentially what the Enlightenment did was it took away the what-if part, the scientific part, the theory about how the world works, away from the church. And at least in Europe, century or so later, more and more people have actually abandoned the church and no longer think that what the Pope says or what the Archbishop of Canterbury says is how you should lead your life, right? In other parts of the world, this is not the case, but definitely in Europe, this is the case. But people have not lost religion. They just ditched the church. People still want to know, and anybody who's ever been with young children still ask the why question. And children still need to be told how to be good. Taught how to be good. And most of us still have an innate desire to be good. And most of us, most people, are simply not able or willing to come up with a coherent theory of how to be a good human, and we turn to thought leaders. We wonder, how would Lady Gaga do this? So the desire for moral guidance is still there, even though the church plays, for most people in Europe, no longer that role. Now, if you look at the literature, the environmental literature on climate change, it is almost religious in tone. Climate is often a discourse of fear. Emissions are portrayed as sin. Climate change is often portrayed as a final reckoning or Armageddon, as a punishment for our sins. And what I take from this is that the environmental movement is, for a significant portion of the population, has essentially taken the role of the church. They're priests. They're telling you what is right and what is wrong. They're telling you how to change your behavior so that there will be redemption. And of course, environmentalists, the environmental movement, also offer you the opportunity of moral superiority and offer you a tribe to belong to. And of course, their incentives to do so are very clear. They're very influential and very rich organizations. And this story only works if they feed you this fear of Armageddon. Right? They have a clear incentive to exaggerate the implications of climate change and other environmental problems. For politicians, climate policy is a godsend. What can you do with climate change? You can save the world. You can channel your inner Bruce Willis and save the world. What better legacy for a politician is there than having saved the world, or at least being seen attempting to? And if it doesn't work, you can always blame Johnny Foreigner for your failure. In the EU, there's always the Poles who don't want to do it. Internationally, there used to be the Chinese and now the Americans who don't want to do it. There's always somebody to shift the blame to. If you are doing climate policy, then you can actually do it in a way that you give subsidies to those who voted for you. And there's an example here. You can distort markets by mandates, technical mandates, or caps, or whatever, to create rents, market frictions for your allies to exploit. And you can deflect attention from your failings. So if you look at the record of Ban Ki-moon as Secretary General of the United Nations, North Korea got nuclear weapons, Libya imploded, Syria descended into hell, and you have the Paris Agreement. So what are you going to talk about? About how serious climate policy is, how serious climate change is, and how you help save things. If you're Christine Lagarde, and you were the finance minister at the time that the euro was created, of France, and you were the head of the IMF for the period of the Eurozone crisis, would you not rather talk about a problem that is completely out of your control and totally not in your mandate? Of course. And that is why people like them talk about this. I advocated a carbon tax. A carbon tax is essentially an excise on energy and food. That is essentially what a carbon tax is. We have those excises already. So from an administrative perspective, a carbon tax is simple. In a country like the UK, you can do this with a team of 3 people, perhaps 5 people in the Treasury. That's all you need. And they would be there to set the tax and to monitor the proceeds. And that is what you need to do. All companies already have the way of collecting these excises. The revenue already has all the systems in place to collect these excises. You don't need to create a new bureaucracy to do this. Instead, what has happened, and what we have observed over the last 30 years or so, is a rapid expansion of the bureaucracy that deals with climate change and deals with climate policy. We don't actually have numbers on the number of civil servants working on climate policy. The graph that you're looking at here is a graph about the international negotiations, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change says that there shall be 1 meeting per year. In blue, you're looking at the number of meetings that have taken place each year under the UNFCCC only. And initially, in the first year, 1995, there was 1 meeting only. And then a few years later, they said, well, the negotiations are becoming complicated, right? So we should have biannual, we should have semi-annual meetings. And then things became more complicated still, and they created, and now the main negotiations are every 3 months. And of course, subcommittees were created and committees were created. And then it turned out that people got terribly confused about all the jargon that was created and all the previous agreements, so they started organizing training sessions and so on and so forth. By now, there are 70 to 80 meetings per year under the UNFCCC only. The annual cost, I reckon, of the meetings alone, travel and wages of the people being in the meetings run to $100 million per year. And for what, you may ask? Emissions are not falling. And this is, of course, immediately in line with Niskanen theory of bureaucracy. Right? What do bureaucrats do? They increase their desk size. That is their incentive, to have more people working for them, to have a bigger budget, to hire more consultants. Of course, what do those civil servants and consultants do? They create additional paperwork, so that you need more consultants to interpret what is going on and more civil servants to monitor what is going on. And that's exactly what we've seen. There's other players, of course. In the period when climate policy was really, really important, we're actually heading back towards that, a lot of other activists sort of felt a little bit neglected and said, well, everybody's talking about climate change, so I better start talking about climate change as well. And feminists declared that climate change is a feminist issue. You can't see the picture here. Human rights activists declared that climate change is also a human rights issue. And of course, we have Naomi Klein saying it's all the fault of the capitalist system, and all the anti-capitalists jumped on the climate bandwagon as well. And of course, greatly complicated the debate. And then there's the other side of the debate. If you listen to an environmentalist or a politician, then often they say, we have to do climate policy because the science says so. Which is wrong. Science never tells you what to do. If you're on the beach and you see the water withdrawing rapidly, then science will tell you there is a tsunami coming. Science will also tell you the best way to survive, if you want to increase your chances of survival, the best strategy is to run for the hills. But science doesn't tell you to run for the hills. It's your survival instinct that tells you this. Science will tell you that most people have a pretty strong survival instinct. But science doesn't tell you to run for the hills. That's a value statement. That's not a statement of fact. But yeah, if you are confronted with a politician who says the science commands that we reduce emissions, and you disagree with that because you don't like the implications for taxes or for gender relationships or for international relations or for whatever, then of course you can make that objection. You can of course also make the objection that this politician or this environmentalist has just made a categorical error, and really it's a mixture of values and facts that we should be worrying about. But if you're on Twitter, you have 140 characters, or you're in primetime television and you have 10 seconds to transmit your message, then the best thing you can do is you say climate is a hoax. The data have been falsified. The science is unsettled or uncertain. If you only have a soundbite to respond, then that is your best bet. And that is what a lot of people have done. Now, I don't believe for one moment that the uncertainties about climate change are so grave that we should not act. But unfortunately, climate science is a fairly young science. It has grown rapidly. It's grown faster than its capacity to absorb and attract good people. So there are easy points to score against climate science and against the behavior of some climate scientists. And that is exploited by some people. And all that explains why the climate debate in so many countries is so terribly polarized and so terribly complicated. I don't think it should be, but it is. Now let's look a little bit at climate policy. And I'm first going to do international climate policy. International climate policy was started in 1985 and it sort of culminated in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. And that is a framework convention that essentially lays down the ground rules for international negotiations. The first meeting under the Rio Convention was in 1995 in Berlin, and from that point on, the aim of the international negotiations was legally binding emission targets. They tried that in Berlin, they sort of succeeded in Kyoto 2 years later, 1997. They tried again a number of times, and the last time they tried was in 2009 in Copenhagen. And all these attempts have essentially failed. And if you know a little bit about game theory, then you immediately understand why. Greenhouse gas emission reduction is a public good, and you're essentially asking countries to voluntarily contribute to that public good. And that doesn't work. If there's no supranational authority, that simply does not work. Game theory has now entered big science. So sometimes we are jealous of geoscientists and all their satellites, 100, 200, 300 million a pop, that are floating about there. We are sort of sometimes envious of high-energy physicists, particle accelerators. Game theory is the same ballpark nowadays. Carlo and Scott Barrett predicted that international environmental agreements on a problem like climate change would fail. And we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars testing their prediction that was made in 1992, in 1993, and in 1994 from 1995 to 2009. And lo and behold, it did not work. Had they just believed Carlo back in 1992, we would have saved the taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. The alternative to legally binding targets, the way we normally provide international or global public goods is through pleasant review. If there is threat of a global epidemic, what do? We organize an international jamboree where people say it's terribly bad, and then we go around with a begging bowl, and Japan will give money, and India will send nurses, and Germany will send doctors, and the US will send tents, and then we have a medical emergency response team to deal with this epidemic. If we need peacekeeping force, what do? We organize an international jamboree where we say, oh God, the problem is terrible, and then we go around with a begging bowl, and Germany will send money, and Pakistan will send troops, and the US will provide logistical support for those troops, and that is how we create an international peacekeeping force. After the fiasco in Copenhagen in 2009, that is essentially what climate policy has turned to. First in Lima, later in Paris, officially confirmed. What we are looking for now in international climate policy are so-called intended nationally determined contributions. It's essentially going around with a begging bowl and asking each country, so how much will you contribute to solving this problem? And there's two keywords here. One is, and this is the language from the Paris Agreement itself, what are the key elements? One is that it's nationally determined. That is, for the UK, Parliament would set these things, not an international treaty, not international negotiations. No, this is a sovereign Parliament that does this. And second, this is not a promise, but it's an aspiration. It's an intention to achieve. There is language that your aspirations should increase in ambition over time, but all of it is terribly non-binding. What we're going to do with those targets or those aspirations is that we're essentially going to add them up and see whether it's sufficient, and 5 years later we conclude it's not, and then we're going to go around with a begging bowl again and say perhaps you can do a little bit more. And also there is a compliance mechanism in the Paris Agreement which says that if you do not meet your aspiration, then a committee will look at your work and respond to you in a manner that is transparent, which is always good. It's non-punitive, right? No sanctions will be imposed, but it's even non-adversarial. That is, no pointed questions shall be asked. And then to top it all off, any party can withdraw from the Paris Agreement at any time. So this is a pledge and review system, right? What I do not understand, and I'm not the only one who doesn't understand, is what is Trump's problem with this? The US was actually a major architect of the Paris Agreement, fully understanding US politics and how difficult it would be if a Republican would ever regain the White House, how difficult it would be. What Trump could have done instead of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement or announcing his withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, he actually has not withdrawn yet, is that they could simply have said, we're going to ditch Obama's plans and we're going to replace it with our plans. And knowing Trump, they could have said, well, ours is better and bigger and more ambitious and more beautiful, right? Because that's what Trump is like. And he could have internationally, he could have gone away with that. Whether he could have gotten away with that domestically is a different story, because it's completely, at the moment, completely untested what the status of the Paris Agreement and the Obama pledges are in federal law, but I don't think it would be a big problem. What the Paris Agreement does do is it puts national governments firmly back in charge of climate policy. The UN is essentially out of the picture. That is what the Paris Agreement says. We return to Westphalen, we return to sovereignty. National governments should take the lead. And they aren't really. Talk a little bit about the US. The EU is having other things on its mind. At the moment, if you look at the emission records from China, then it's completely unclear what their emissions really are. There's often, between different estimates, for the same emissions, there's often 30% difference. So China doesn't know how much it emits, right? Nobody knows how much China really emits. And that is all because China is a big and complex country. It doesn't have a statistical service like more developed countries do. There's a lot of illegal coal mining still going on, and so on and so forth. There's incentives for civil servants to lie to their superiors, and so on and so forth. We simply do not really know what is going on in China, and nobody really knows what's going on in China. The picture that you're looking at is from India. And in black, you're looking at the annual emissions of CO2 from coal-fired power generation in India, if we only take those power plants that are operating. And then in purple, you're adding those that are currently under construction. In red, those that have permits to build. And then in orange and yellow, things that people are talking about. And what you see is that there's a substantial expansion of coal planned and foreseen in India. What you can't see from this graph is that if India indeed goes down this route, then it alone will blow through the 2 degrees target. So countries are not stepping up. There's problems in Europe as well. These are pictures from the UK. People have taken a very strong dislike of wind turbines in this country, particularly wind turbines that they can see. And within the UK, there is this other big problem called Brexit. There's political instability in this country, as you may have noticed. There's been a period of instability before that. The first thing that Prime Minister May did was reorganize the Department of Energy and Climate so that the civil servants who are supposed to be working looking after climate policy are fighting about who sits in what office at the moment. But Brexit itself also has ramifications. First, it takes up basically all political attention, as well as basically all capacity in the civil service. It's just so very complex that it's very hard to do anything else or think or talk about anything else. But there's also very specific components of Brexit that make UK climate policy very, very, the outlook for UK climate policy troubled. One is the decision by the Prime Minister that we shall not be subject to the European Court of Justice any longer, which immediately means that the UK will drop out of Euratom. Now, that has ramifications if you are dependent on radiotherapy, or you know somebody or love somebody who is, but it also has implications for the nuclear industry, namely that on the 30th of March 2019, unless there is a deal, and it doesn't seem to be a deal in the making at the moment, then the UK will be in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that means that the nuclear power plants in the UK will shut down. Some of the current investments have already been postponed for exactly that reason. And nuclear power is one of the major strategies in the UK to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Another major strategy in the UK to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and keep the lights on at the same time is to build interconnectors to the continent. And again, those interconnectors depend on the European Investment Bank for money, and that money will be gone after Brexit if we don't get a deal, let alone a good deal. But also the European Union has been very active in creating the market regulations on both sides of the interconnector so that that thing actually functions. And that regulatory certainty is out of the window as well with Brexit. And then, of course, the major policy instrument to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases in the UK is the European Cap and Trade System, the EU ETS. And also, if you don't like the European Court of Justice, then you're not in the EU ETS. Simple as that. So Brexit creates an enormous problem for UK climate policy, on top of all the other problems that it will create. But from the perspective of Brussels, the UK leaving is also a major nightmare, because the UK has always been at the forefront of European environmental policy. And with the UK no longer pushing for greenhouse gas emission reduction Europe-wide, the Germans and the Scandinavians and the Dutch have lost a major ally. And it is much more likely that the voices of the Italians and the Greeks and the Friends and the Poles will prevail in Europe-wide discussions about the environment, which immediately implies that Europe will water down its climate plans as well, right? So Brexit is terribly important to me. So yeah, I don't have a very positive story for you to hear today. Climate policy is in deep trouble, and it's not just Trump. It is China, it's India, it's Europe as well. So to wrap up, I've argued that climate change is the smallest problem with a simple solution, but there's many factors out there to hide this very basic truth from you, right? There's a lot of people out there who want to complicate the climate problem because it is in their interest to do so. So I think that the way forward really is if all those people would go away and worry about other things and start fighting about other things. On the environmental front, we have the ocean plastics. We're getting terribly concerned about urban air quality again. And if you're from India or China or increasingly from Africa, you should worry about air pollution much more than people here. And hopefully that will absorb a lot of the sort of politics of climate policy, and that would make climate policy then in response less sensational and more technocratic. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.